The first presenter we have is Brian Hughes, and Brian is a professor of psychology at the National University of Ireland in Galway and is a member of IPSWO's advisory group on research and specialist services for people with PWS. So Brian, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Thank you very much for the introduction and for the opportunity to speak here today. I suppose I should also mention that as well as being a professor of psychology, I'm also a parent of a 19-year-old young man with Prader-Willi syndrome. So hence the picture on the top right-hand corner of my son experiencing well-being in his residential care setting. As an academic, I suppose I'm prone to being a little bit theoretical and maybe perhaps woolly and ponderous, but I hope that as a parent, I also have some direct experience and some clear ideas to share with you today. What I hope to talk about, or what I want to focus on today, is this concept of well-being, which can be said to mean lots of different things. So my presentation will really address 4 points. One is that I will look at the various concepts that are intertwined with the idea of well-being. What are these various things that it might mean? Secondly, I'll look at the different parts of life or the different domains of life in which well-being can be considered. There are layers there. But thirdly, and importantly, what are the specific challenges presented in Prader-Willi syndrome with respect to well-being and how we even talk about it? And then finally, just a recurring theme, I suppose, to consider important the fact that well-being is more than just the absence of problems or the absence of mental ill health. That well-being is something positive. So what does that look like? Now, Tony has already presented you with this scary looking schematic that representing many of the different dimensions and consequences of how we talk about well-being and quality of life. And you can see that it is a multi-story diagram. So we have some considerations of the person's environment. And in fact, a lot of things here are what I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes. One of the consequences of understanding all of this is to, or one of the contexts for understanding all of this are, of course, the sort of problem issues, the biological issues, the functioning issues, if you like, the psychiatric issues at times. And there can be a risk that we end up getting sucked into a discussion, not of well-being, but of the opposite of well-being. So do let me know if we go down that road. And of course, one of the other areas to bear in mind is that when we talk about well-being with our people with Prader-Willi syndrome, I suppose we're interested in the experience that they have, but also in how we might even detect their well-being and how we might evaluate and assist people to achieve well-being. So we need to have an eye on things like measurement and intervention as well. Now, I'm going to depart from the diagram, or maybe just park the diagram, shall we say, and try to simplify matters a little bit, because we're often really talking about happiness in this context. And of course, this is a great philosophical point or a proposition, what is happiness and what makes you happy? And often when we discuss well-being and we talk about happiness in a clinical context or in relation to Prader-Willi syndrome specifically, people will sometimes say something like, happiness it's overrated, because you can be happy, but you can be you can have all sorts of problems in your life and all sorts of compromises in your life as well. And you can be physically sick, for example, or you could be disabled, you can be unable to do things. And you might say you're happy without actually being happy. So the word happiness and the idea of measuring happiness might be something that we say is overrated. And it is true that there are many different ways of even talking about happiness and talking about well-being in terms of emotions or satisfaction or quality of life, as we will be discussing a little bit later. It can become very overwhelming when you try to talk about, therefore, mental health or well-being in Prader-Willi syndrome, because there's so many different approaches you can take. And the risk is that we end up with a kind of shopping list approach, where we just have more and more ways of talking about well-being without any structure or order. So let me try to put some, I suppose, of a framework around a lot of these concepts, and that will help us integrate them and then discuss them. And the purpose, of course, of this session is really to open up discussion rather than to give you final answers before you've even had time to ask your questions. There are a number of approaches that people commonly use to try to, organize all of these ideas. And this is a little bit of the academic in me coming out. There is a long tradition of what we call kind of wanting theories that relates to, is the person getting what they want? And this is often, the way economists talk about well-being, that a person is in a state of well-being if they're getting what they want, if they're getting materially what they want out of life. That's one approach. Another approach is to focus on liking as a concept. This is more psychological, and this is about whether a person really just feels good and feels positive emotion. And we define well-being then in terms of those emotions or moods, or even also their thoughts. Are they evaluating? What is their opinion about their life? Do they feel they have a good life? And the third kind of approach people sometimes take then is the needing approach. That not is somebody getting what they want, or do they think they have a good life, but are they getting what they need? And sometimes a person might need something that causes them discomfort or inconvenience, but makes their life better in the long run. So considering what people need as opposed to what they want or what they might like is another approach, another way of looking at well-being. And you might be aware of things like Maslow's theory of hierarchy of needs. You need all of these things in life. You need security, you need good health, you need an opportunity to express yourself. You need social support and social relationships and so on. So there are things you might need that you don't even realize you need, which draws our attention to the fact that sometimes well-being is something we have to discuss with a person, and we have to maybe advise a person as to aspects of their well-being, because they might not realize it themselves. And that applies to all of us, not just for people who might have Prader-Willi syndrome. So I think the most important issue to bear in mind is that we need not to pick among these ideas. We need to combine them in some way. And we need to take all of these things into account. And if we're talking about well-being and we're only taking some of these things into account, then we're not talking about well-being in its entirety. Now, in terms of Prader-Willi syndrome and the various ways in which well-being can be challenging, let me just look at this. This is called the nested model of well-being, where psychologists have tried to combine all of the different ways in which well-being might operate in a person's life. And this will give us a sort of an order within which to look at things relating to Prader-Willi syndrome. So, for example, a person can have a subjective well-being where they just talk about or where we just consider their experience of life and satisfaction. We can think about well-being in terms of health and function, whether a person's in good health as assessed by a clinical expert or doctor, whatever that might be. We can look at the environmental domain. Does the person have access to high quality, social support and social environment and so on? And there's a third domain that people talk about as well, which is our fourth domain, which is values and ideology. Is a person living a life in a good way, or do they feel that they're making good decisions, or have they got a sense of purpose in life? That's a little bit more vague. But I suppose from the very specific to the very vague, we can consider Prader-Willi syndrome in each of these respects. And let me show you what I mean by that. So we're going to look at the specific challenges presented by Prader-Willi syndrome with respect to how we even talk about well-being and what we might reflect on when we're trying to cultivate well-being. And if we look at these layers or these domains as a structure, we can consider Prader-Willi syndrome in every case. So for example, when we consider subjective well-being, the person's experience of happiness, we can understand that there are particular sort of features of Prader-Willi syndrome that cause difficulty for a person to be said to achieve well-being. Chief among them, of course, is hyperphagia, and the urge to eat. Because a person might want to eat, it doesn't necessarily mean that it will lead to their well-being. And so there is the argument that we need to restrict a person's behavior in order to guarantee their well-being. So that's an example of how we might consider well-being in terms of what is good for a person rather than what they want. So that balance needs to be struck there, and it's very difficult in Prader-Willi syndrome. There's also the propensity for emotional outbursts and destructive behaviors and other things that a person might want to engage in that actually endangers their well-being. So when we look at well-being in terms of the person's own wishes, it's very difficult to cultivate well-being without some compromise there in terms of a person's choices and autonomy. So people need to be supported, of course, in making good choices, but we need to be aware that a person with Prader-Willi syndrome will often find it difficult, certainly in the heat of the moment, to make a good choice that contributes to their well-being. In terms of looking at well-being in the health and functioning domain, again, there are stressors that arise for a person with Prader-Willi syndrome from physical factors. So things like the constant hunger is often a trigger or often a context that causes problems for a person. There are physical issues relating to scoliosis and mobility, skin picking and so on that are physical problems, but they contribute to a person's well-being because of their consequences. When we consider the environmental domain, we need to be aware that a person with Prader-Willi syndrome will often have impaired social awareness. So if we're considering how a person might build relationships or avail of social support or have a fulfilling social life, we need to be somewhat cognizant of the fact that a person with Prader-Willi syndrome will often look at social relationships differently and uniquely to them, and will sometimes engage in oppositional kind of behavior that makes social engagement difficult with other people. So that's another set of issues there that needs to be worked on in order to guarantee well-being. And I've put an additional comment there about ableism in society, and I have a little star next to it, because it's certainly the case that with any disability, it can be difficult to engage with other people in a social network, given the way that society is set up. Schools, shops, hospitals, and so on, they're all designed for able-bodied people, really, and it can be difficult for a person with PWS to fit in that way. And the solution to that might not be to change the person with PWS, but it might be to change other people's attitudes and maybe the environment a little bit. And then finally, when we consider the big questions of happiness, are you fulfilled? Do you have a sense of purpose? Are you proud of yourself? There can be challenges in PWS to self-reflection in that a person with PWS can look upon the world and look upon themselves in ways that those of us who don't have Prader-Willi syndrome can sometimes find hard to reach or hard to imagine. And a person, for example, will often look at the world from their own perspective exclusively and so on, as well as having ongoing anxiety of different kinds. So this is simply an effort to try to summarize the dilemma that when we talk about well-being in Prader-Willi syndrome, yes, it's complicated, but at the same time, we can do it systematically, and we can look at the different domains of well-being and use that as a starting point to help cultivate well-being in people with PWS. Ultimately, when we want to consider well-being in people with PWS, we consider those domains and definitions with a view then to maybe measuring or evaluating or checking in on well-being with people in a systematic way that makes sense. Interpreting what's going on in order to then have some kind of intervention. This would be sort of the grand strategy of talking about well-being in this sense. With that then, just to finally make the point that throughout all of this, when we talk about well-being, we look at all these different domains and all of these different, I suppose, ways in which we can sort of conceptualize well-being. The take-home message, I think, is that well-being is far more than just the absence of skin picking or the absence of a temper tantrum or the absence of problematic behavior. Well-being is something that allows a person to fulfill their ambitions and have a prosperous life in terms of their emotional health, having good relationships and enriched experiences and so on. And it's a big challenge in Prader-Willi syndrome, I would say, as a parent, is to remember that all of these positive experiences are central to well-being, because so much of the focus can be on removing and addressing clinical problems and behavioral problems. And it can be difficult to make time to cultivate the positive aspects of life as well. So with that, I think I've used up my time, so I'll stop there.